So this is the agenda for the online forum today. We're about to move into the feature presentation and then the Q&A portion afterwards. And then for those who want to stick around and play a Kahoot quiz, I've got 9 skill testing questions on invasive insects in Canada, and we'll be wrapped up by 1 o'clock. And next, for those who might be new to our events, I wanted to share a little bit about the ISCMV. So we're a not-for-profit society established in 2006, and our entire goal is to work towards improving invasive species management within the Metro Vancouver region. And so our job is to help you guys do your jobs better. We answer questions, connect people to resources, host regional events, and develop resources. And we also have a small seasonal field crew that we operate as well. So I have another poll coming your way. I'm wondering whether this is the first time that you are attending an ISCMV event. So you'll see that pop up on your screen now. Could be an online or in person, whether you've attended any of our events in the past. Okay, so it looks like about 59% have, so welcome to our returning participants, and it's great to see quite a few new people as well. Okay. So for those that do want to play the quiz, I'm just giving you a heads up now that there are a couple different ways that you can participate. Again, this will happen after the presentation, but you'll need a device to play the game. You can download the free Kahoot app on your smartphone or tablet, or you can visit www.kahoot.it. And so if you're joining via the computer or tablet that you are using to view the seminar, note that you'll have to split your screen because you'll need to see my shared screen, and you'll also need to see your Kahoot screen where you enter your answers. And so you don't need to do anything yet. I'll put this slide up at the very end, and I'll share the game pin when it starts. So that's how you can join the game live. All right, and now the moment that you're all here for. It is my great pleasure to welcome Paul van Westendorp to the online forum. He is the BC Ministry of Agriculture's Chief Apiarist, which means he's a beekeeping specialist. As a UBC graduate, Paul had the opportunity to be involved in apiculture research, followed by several years of tropical apiculture in East Africa. In the late 1980s, he was appointed as Provincial Apiculturist of Alberta and was subsequently appointed to the same position in BC. And he is talking to us today about the Giant Asian Hornet, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can see his screen. All right, Paul, it should be ready for you.
Oops, oh dear, I did something wrong. Can everybody see me now?
We can't see your screen.
You can?
We cannot.
Oh dear, I did something wrong then. Hold on. Boy almighty, hold on.
What is it about?
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button.
About?
No worries. I have your presentation as backup, but it's probably easier if you do it yourself. There we go.
Good.
Great. All right, so before Paul gets started, just a reminder, if everyone can mute themselves, I'm hearing a little bit of background chatter.
I'm a bit wary to start fidgeting around with this screen again, because there is something where I can get rid of this text, but if most of you don't mind, just ignore the text and just look at the pictures, the slides.
There's nothing there. They're there for a year.
Is somebody talking, or am I?
Okay. Yeah.
You're good to go ahead. I'm going to try and mute everybody else but you now, Paul, so please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to speak about this this particular invasive species, the Asian or the Giant Asian Hornet. Actually, I should have changed it. It is actually the Asian Giant Hornet. there has been a never-ending battle about the nomenclature of this. And if you look at the next slide, that is where the confusion comes in. Before I say anything about Mandarinia itself, if you look at the column on the left side, you will see there a whole number of common names of describing various species of Vespa. Vespa, it's evolved in Asia, in Eastern Asia, and that is where you will find most of the species. There are about some 20 plus species of Vespa. There is only one representative in Europe, which is called Vespa grabro, the European hornet, but all the others are Asian in origin. And as you can see, that the nomenclature is quite confusing with the Asian giant hornet, and then we have a normal Asian hornet and an Asian predatory wasp, and on it goes. I have color-coded them a little bit because I will be talking about the first group of 5 on the left side, and on the right side you will find the scientific names, the Latin names of these particular species. And it is for that reason, because of the confusing aspects of it, that we tend to refer to the scientific name. The first 2 of them, that is Mandarinia and Soror, I will refer to those in particular because both of them have been detected here in British Columbia in the last calendar year, or since 2019. They are sister species, and they have one common thing, and that is that both of them are ground nesters, and that is an important feature that demands a lot of attention on our part to try to eradicate this pest. In Europe, I will refer to that briefly as well. There they have, since 2004, they have the introduction of Vespa Filipina that has spread throughout Western Europe. And then furthermore, you have a number of other specialist hornets, Basalis and Ducalis. The remainders, let's just ignore those for now. As you can see, it is a very formidable, truly hornet-looking character, and it is very much characterized by its very massive head. It is a shield-like head, and of course that has been evolving to accommodate its massive mandibles, which are designed to eat other insects. The story about Vespa Mandarina here in British Columbia started in August of 15th or 17th, when 2 specimens were collected by an observant beekeeper in Nanaimo, and I requested him to courier the 2 specimens over, which he did, and it was subsequently confirmed by various parties that we were dealing with Vespa Mandarina. Since that time, during the subsequent weeks, there were a number of other sightings in Nanaimo, and this eventually resulted in the discovery of a nest in a public park right in central Nanaimo, and with the assistance of Nanaimo beekeepers, this nest was found and subsequently eradicated on September the 18th. This particular species is favoring forested habitat for its nest, and as you can see, and it also prefers sloping surfaces, so there is well and good drainage involved. And this is the photograph on the right side. This is the photograph taken of the public park, and just left of this large tree out there, this pine tree, the nest was found, and on the left side you can see the entrance of it. This was 12 hours later, the very next morning, after the nest had been eliminated. You can see on the right side also the path, the footpath, and that is precisely what is of greatest concern to us. While we were there, although there were still a few stragglers around, straggling hornets, there were a number of people that walked by on this public park. Of course, to them, they didn't understand or the reasons why a few men were standing around in a public park but they probably speculated far and wide as to what we were doing. But they were never even aware that there was actually a nest so close, less than 1.5 meters from the public park, public walkway. The eradication took place. There was one of the Nanaimo beekeepers is an entomologist in his own right, and he had decided to eradicate the nest. He didn't want to contaminate it with any insecticide because he was thinking about further study on this, and so he chose to use CO2, the fire retardant material. And that was blasted into the entrance of the nest. The removal of oxygen plus the temperature drop caused these insects to be immobilized temporarily, and so there was a feverish digging taking place after the CO2 was applied, and a bucket with alcohol, with methanol, windshield wiper fluid was used to dump as many insects in there as possible. Just as a footnote, it is not the way we plan to eradicate any future nests. We don't care about the insecticidal residues that may result in the future. We would, if we find a nest in the future, it means a very quick eradication of the nest rather than the careful removal through digging and everything else. The nest eradication took place at dusk because wasps, hornets, and bees are basically, they have an optical spectrum. They cannot see in the dark very well, and so they don't tend to fly in the dark at all. And that is why any of these kind of eradication measures are taking place in the evening when it is dark. That nest produced roughly 200 individuals, plus the queen. Some of those individuals were identified as drones, and no queens or virgin queens were identified. This is important because this is the life cycle of this species is such that over the course of the spring and summer season, these nests expand very slowly. You have one egg-laying individual, which is then the queen, of course, and all of her offspring are worker bees, or worker hornets, rather. These are sterile females, and they will help to build the nest over the course of the spring and summer season. It is only And during this build-up phase, these workers are predating on all kinds of insects, mostly larger insects, of course, to provide food for the nest. It is not until basically late July and August when the nest is supposed to be of a sufficient size that it gets ready to produce sexually maturing offspring. And in order to accomplish that goal, the nest requires a large amount of animal protein, and that is when they go into the slaughter stage or into the raiding stage in which these hornets are going to go after honeybee colonies. When they get into this stage, a scout of these hornets will go to an apiary when it can find an apiary, and it will basically assess the suitability of the various colonies that are there. It will pick a particular colony, and it will then leave a pheromonal mark behind, and pheromone. It will then return to its own nest to basically solicit the input of her sisters, and a raiding party is formed, and maybe a dozen or 24 of these hornets will then return to this particular marked colony. They will then start to pick at the entrance of the hive and get all the bees out. They are, of course, create a panic. The hornets are not particularly interested in feeding on these adult bees. They just create panic. Eventually, the defenses of the honeybee colony subside, and they will gain entrance to the nest of the bees, and they will start to take the bee brood out of the hive. That is the material as meatballs, if you will. They will take that back to their nest and will feed that to their offspring, to the larvae of the hornet larvae. The photograph that you can see out here is shows some of these adult hornets. They are all dead, of course, because it is after the elimination of the nest. But you can see that the comb is in paper material and with unusually large cells. And you can see here at the top some of the larval stages, as well as a couple of pupal stages. Note the scale at the bottom. The one on the top, of course, are inches, and down below are centimeters, and you can see there how huge these cells are. Quite a beautiful, beautiful example of how they use this wood material. Everything quieted down after this nest was destroyed in Nanaimo, and we were just hoping that, of course, no other individuals had escaped from this particular site, and everything turned to normal and quiet. Until suddenly in the middle of November, to our huge surprise, there was a report in with a set of photographs of a hornet specimen found right in central White Rock, of all places. I went out there. The specimen had been destroyed, and was unfortunately no tissue was available, which was very unfortunate. But that is what it was. But the photographic evidence was such that I was able to verify that it was an actual location that where this specimen was found. This resulted immediately into notifying the residences nearby, as well as the city of White Rock itself. The Parks Board and everybody else was involved to be notified about the potential of having a nest somewhere in White Rock. Again, things quieted down for only 3 weeks until suddenly we got a report in Blaine, just south of the border, where just east of Blaine, 2 specimens were found on December the 8th. This was an escalating concern to us because this was highly unusual. Not only is the fact that these 2 specimens were found on the same location, which strongly indicated, or didn't prove it, but certainly indicated that that this was coming from a nest, and that this nest was still in an active condition. And so late in the season, queens, they disperse after they mate in August and September, and they will hide in small crevices and small spaces, and then re-emerge in the springtime. In this particular case, it suggested that there was an actual nest still in active operation. One of the 2 specimens was collected and was subsequently submitted to a lab for sequencing, for DNA analysis, including the ones that we had collected from Nanaimo, and both of those were sequenced. And it turned out that the specimen from Blaine had a South Korean origin, while the specimen from Nanaimo appeared to have a Japanese origin. Without speculating too much or how accurate that these assessments were, because there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of genetic variation in this population in its native range. But if this is proving to be correct about their origin, it clearly indicates that these hornets are being introduced onto the West Coast in the future, probably as well, as a result of our trade with East Asia. The Washington State Department of Agriculture in cooperation with USDA. We are working closely with them to do an intensive amount of monitoring and to determine whether or not this particular species has been establishing itself here on the West Coast. After December, again, things quieted down quite nicely, and then suddenly another find was made in just west of Blaine, farther south. I mean, don't focus on the crosses too closely in terms of their accuracy. It is an approximation, but the one just in Blaine, you have one further south, close to the number 548 out there. And then a bit later, one in Custer. Custer is on the way down on Highway 5 down towards Bellingham. At the same time, we found in the middle of May and suddenly a find in just south of Langley, and as you can see there is a mark out there, and that is approximately something like over 20 kilometers away south or northeast of the White Rock find. Clearly this is outside of the foraging range of these insects, and that would suggest that there perhaps is another nest nearby. The specimen of Langley, we collected this, and it strongly suggested that we were dealing here with a queen. It certainly had swollen ovaries that suggested that she was mated. But I have not been able to find the spermatheca, the sperm holding organ that is part of this beast, if she was fully fertilized and mated. So we don't know that for sure, but there are strong indications that this was a queen, and as a result, by catching her or by her demise, it means that a nest was averted. So what is the reason we are concerned about this? Of course, the Vespa Mandarina is a very large insect, and it is an apex predator in the insect world. No other insects really feast on her or on them. It is, as I mentioned earlier, a serious predator of honeybees. It is expected that it will adapt quite readily to BC or the climatic conditions in coastal British Columbia. And when we study the natural range in Asia, it is clear that it prefers maritime conditions, and it likes moist forest habitat for building its nests. So for the rest of British Columbia and Canada, for that matter, it is very possible that it may not really travel very far inland, because we have the very dry conditions of the Okanagan, not to mention, of course, passing the Coast Range. And then we have the formidable Rocky Mountains to overcome. And of course, the prairies are highly unsuitable for that insect to live in, because there is not enough forest habitat. And of course, it is also important that climate may not just be the sole criterion in determining its success to establish itself here in British Columbia. There may be other factors as well, such as it's the prey fauna to which it will depend, and the competition it may face with indigenous wasps and other insects. So it is not certain that she will necessarily, or that this particular species will be successful on the West Coast. Our main concern at the present time remains the potential for conflict with humans, because it is a ground nester, and as the photographs has shown to you earlier, it is the inadvertent disturbance of a nest that will cause tragedy or high potential of tragedy when people unexpectedly get attacked by these highly defensive hornets. I should mention, though, that the hornets individually, when they forage, are of no concern. They tend to be following the strategy of avoidance. They don't mind humans or anything else. They're just after insect prey. It is only the nest disturbance that is the big problem. And that is also why in Japan, which is of course a very densely populated country, where there are every year some 30 to 50 human fatalities as a result of nest disturbance. These insects are large enough. They have a stinging apparatus that is not a dagger, but it is it is a dagger. It is not a harpoon. Honeybees have a harpoon stinging apparatus, while these hornets, they have a dagger. And because of the sheer volume, size of that insect, it can repeatedly sting and deliver a large volume of venom. In this particular case, it also has a certain peptide, an enzyme that causes tissue necrosis, and therefore you end up having wounds that are bleeding and are subject to potential infection. So it's a very unpleasant insect to encounter in case you get a conflict like this. Again, it is marked by an unusually large shield-shaped head. And it is also its potential Achilles heel, in that beekeepers are probably smart enough to develop certain strategies in entrance reducers and screened entrances that will make it very difficult for these hornets to gain access to a hive, to a honeybee colony. The surveying that we are doing this year is in two parts, or the one on Vancouver Island is of course focused on the Nanaimo area, and there is a very active, vigilant beekeeper group who are monitoring the situation very closely, and I'm happy to report that ever since 2020 there has been no further sightings of this particular insect. So we're hoping that perhaps the elimination of this nest proved to be very successful. In White Rock and now in Langley, we are doing monitoring that is on a stepped up approach. We are trying to synchronize our monitoring activities as much as possible with the anticipated development of these nests, assuming that these nests exist. So we have a set of traps that we put out in White Rock initially. These were first sticky traps, but we became kind of uncomfortable about those because of the danger of attracting non-target organisms. We used tanglefoot traps. You are probably all familiar with what they look like. And even though we put some screens on those, we were worried that not only other insects would get in there, but perhaps even songbirds and those. So we decided not to pursue that any further, and we have been installing bottle traps since. And we don't know whether these bottle traps are very effective, simply because we haven't collected any of these darn hornets yet. Now, it gives me some comfort to know that in Washington State, where they are doing a very similar program, they haven't had the pleasure of catching any of these hornets either. So we're not necessarily doing anything wrong. Maybe all of us are doing the wrong thing. That is quite possible. So we are a bit worried about dealing with these false negatives. I'm going to apply some changes to it, and we are now working with a particular company who is involved with pheromone development, and we may be putting in some pheromone lures that have proven to be very promising in the control of Vespa Filipina in Europe. And we hope that perhaps these pheromones may be drawing the attention, if there are any of these hornets out here, that they will be attracted to these traps as well. We have been relying, ever since the beginning, we have been relying very heavily on beekeepers and the public at large, as well as municipalities, border agency, the RCMP, and you name whom, as well as folks like you. And it is important that we basically try to use the eyes and ears of the public. and agencies to help us to locate these nests. And as you can see here, there are a number of valuable websites, the BC Invasive Councils. I saw that Gail Wallen is on this call as well, and she's involved with BC Invasives. And we have also, of course, the Ministry of the Environment has a site out here as well. And anyone else who finds something is more than welcome to send me their suspected case of a big hornet of some sort. I should tell you, which is somewhat amusing, that ever since this spring, I have been the recipient of I don't know how many of these reports of suspected cases of whatever. And at times, I must admit, it is somewhat sad to admit that there are some people that don't even know the difference between a hornet or a wasp and a bumblebee. I mean, sweet bumblebees are being caught in this malaise, and often I get beautiful photographs of a pure bumblebee. Bumblebees, for heavens. You wonder what people did during high school or elementary school and don't even know how to identify a sweet bumblebee. Maybe I'm just talking too much in entomological terms, but I was kind of saddened by it. And people who bring in a fantastic photograph of a fly or a crane fly is one of the other popular things. So we have also released a pest alert bulletin, and that one shows photographic evidence of these hornets and also what kind of similar species can be expected at this time of the year. Earlier in the season, we have a lot of these elm sawflies that are being submitted as suspect cases of hornets, and of course they're not. And right now, the season is now progressing far enough that we are now starting to see more and more photographs or reports of horntails. And horntails, of course, have these massive ovipositors, and they look to the uninitiated quite fearsome, and people are wanting to know what they're dealing with. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of contacts with municipalities and residents and everybody else. We are stepping up the situation in the weeks to come with more traps in key areas. And the strategy that we are trying to follow is that if we have a set of sightings that we can then extrapolate through triangulation the approximate location, geographical location of a suspected nest, and then have boots on the ground to try to locate these nests and then go through an eradication process. The eradication is really the end of the journey, and we will only use apiculture program staff to do this for not only for liability reasons, but also for the fact that my staff, we are quite familiar with the behavior of stinging insects and recognize their behavior, and it would only be suitable for us to deal with these challenges. I like to point out how sometimes things do evolve, and therefore I mentioned again about local beekeepers, but I recall in August, September, I was instructed, because I work for the Ministry of Agriculture, that without us doing our own thing, I was instructed to consult with the various ministries. And this was interesting, because it's not that there's anything wrong with it, that they are wonderful people in their own accord, but I was instructed to contact, well, I probably miss a number of ministries, but it included then the Ministry of Environment, CFIA, the Forest Lands Natural Resources, the Ministry of Health. I had to consult with UBC and local governments and so on. I mean, this was turning out to be a gigantic committee, and well, when government is involved with committee forming, you know exactly what happens. Not much. I was so worried that we would end up losing, that the genie was going to get out of the bottle, so to say, with that nest in Nanaimo progressing too far and issuing these mature mated queens that will then disperse and create greater infestation. As a result, I appealed to the local beekeepers in Nanaimo, and they were on target within, well, I would almost dare say within hours. I couldn't believe their response. action was immediate and very successful, and I cannot give them enough credit for the fantastic response that they offered us, and I think all of us should be thankful for this. In fact, all these photographs were taken afterwards when the nest was already eradicated. I mentioned earlier about other infestations or other introductions into the West Coast. Some of you may recall that in May of 2019, there was a widely publicized incident of a huge insect that had been collected on Vancouver Harbor. This ended up at UBC in the collection at the Biodiversity Center at UBC. And this was initially identified as Ducalis, but later was it reclassified as Vespa soror. And you may recall at the start of this presentation, I was referring to soror as being the sister species to Mandarinia. They look very similar, they act very similar, and both of them have ground nesters. And this particular specimen was actually a queen, and it was separately introduced, of course, and was discovered in May of 2019. So that was a few months before Mandarinia was confirmed on Nanaimo. So this really suggests that we have repeated and future introductions of these kind of insects. Vespa Filipina, I just like to refer to them very briefly. This is the beast that has been inundating Western Europe since 2004 in Bordeaux, and it has been spreading ever since. And it is a very different nester. It builds up its nest in the top of the tree canopy. It's very difficult to control, and it has a side entrance instead of a bottom entrance. This is probably not of great interest to you, but the insect produces very large nests, up to 3,000 individuals, and it is a very serious predator of honeybees. It doesn't rate nests the way Mandarinia does. It basically picks adult bees out of the air by basically hanging around the entrance of a hive. The Europeans have spent over 20 million euros since its introduction, and as you can see here on the list, the hornet continues to spread quite happily. So the effect is not very great. Similar insect species, I referred to them briefly. The one on the right side is the sawfly, the elm sawfly. There are various species depending on location, but basically they are very common insects. They are, of course, don't produce colonies. They are just solitary insects, and they're very large and big, and people, of course, are concerned what they are. And on the left side, these ones are now coming on stream at this time of the year, and these are the classic horntails. And with the ovipositor at the bottom, that is, of course, a pretty intimidating sight, but they are pretty harmless insects. The last one here that I wanted to show you is a Scarlet Wasp, and just because of the coloring and its appearance, some people get excited about this as well. This insect is far smaller than the hornet, the Vespa Mandarina is. I think that is the last slide. So, any questions?
Great, thank you so much, Paul. We do have one question so far from David. What do they do to manage the hornets in Japan?
Not very successful. It is difficult to get really solid information from them because much of it is old studies, and studies all written in Japanese. And so translations are often very difficult to come by. But so far, the control has been very poor, even though the Japanese have put in a lot of effort over the years to try to find means to control this pest. I think it is worth to mention, because of quite a few reports have come in of people saying, well, we have learned that the Japanese bees are resistant or are capable to deal with the hornets. Well, that's not entirely true. It is another species of honeybee that is managed out there. It's called Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee or the Eastern honeybee versus our European honeybee. The Asian honeybee is, Apis cerana is also cultivated, but is a very poor performer in honey production. It has smaller colonies compared to our European honeybees. And of course, our European honeybees play a key role in crop pollination. What Apis cerana does do is that when Mandarina is starting to raid the nest, the Eastern honeybees, they will create a ball around the invading insect, raise the temperature up to 47 degrees or something, and basically cook the insect and cause it to suffocate. And as a result, the wasp or the hornet dies. There are, with Apis cerana, a whole range of diseases, particularly viruses, that we are quite worried about, and therefore there is no chance and no interest of getting Apis cerana here in North America. In terms of the hornets, it is, I mentioned earlier, a densely populated country, Japan, and it lives in the forest. And we believe that it is so endemically present that the Japanese have not been able to control it very effectively.
All right, questions are coming in fast and furious. The next one from Marcus. How many queens are typically produced by nest?
That depends entirely on the success of the nest building process. So the nest that was unearthed in Nanaimo may or could have produced perhaps a few dozen successful sexually mature females. Keep in mind that out of those sexually maturing females, only a certain portion of them will actually mate successfully. It has been reported, I find it quite interesting to read about the sexual life of these hornets, but apparently many of these virgin queens are not particularly receptive to being mated. So they are often quite strong in rejecting the overtures of the drones. So there is a portion of these queens that actually will never mate. And they will survive the winter, but of course only the successfully mated females will have a chance to establish a nest in the next year. So there may be, from a size of 200, there may be a few dozen of those queens, of which a portion will be mated. In its native range, it has been reported that nests can grow as large as 700 or over 700 individuals, which is a pretty large colony.
All right, from Janet now. I believe that I saw one in Cloverdale early May in the vicinity of 174th and 88th Avenue. Is this likely?
Very possible. Again, open fields and a lack of forest cover is not something that they find attractive. It is certainly possible, but we very much rely on the submission of either physical evidence or photographic evidence rather than hearsay. We receive dozens and dozens of these reports, and in many cases it is anecdotal. And the problem is that people often their imagination tends to get a hold of them greater than what the reality is. So suddenly, if everybody is alerted to some of these insects that have been ignored in the past now suddenly become a major target for them. And the problem is that now we have a lot of bald-faced hornets, the ones that are native, that are humdrum, that you find them anywhere, are often being reported as well. I have here, just for illustration purposes, here a very interesting specimen encased in plastic. It won't do anything anymore, but it is one of these hornets, and they are about 3 to 4 times the size of a bald-faced hornet. So we get a lot of false reports. So Cloverdale is possible, but I would suspect it is more likely to be closer to the border if they are around. But please keep on looking. Submit it to us.
So I think we have more questions than we have time for. We have time for one more question. Paul, would you be willing for me to send you additional questions that we can't cover for you to answer by email, and then I can post that on our website?
Absolutely.
Great. So for those that might have joined a little bit later, this session is being recorded, and I'll provide a follow-up message to everybody registered for the forum when the link to the recording and all the other resources that were mentioned. I'll also post the alert that Paul mentioned, and I'll also provide the answers to the other questions that we don't have time to address in person. So all that will go on our website, and I'll send you the link within a couple of days. So last question from Jason: what is the main thing we should be telling staff to look out for in the field? The Hornet itself and its identifying characteristics, any particular warning signs of a nest?
Well, of course, when you see these unusually large insects flying around, or you may only find one, that's the more likely scenario. An insect that is close to the size of the smallest hummingbirds, and also the sound of the wing beat is quite different from that of a normal wasp or from a honeybee or a bumblebee. Then please be on the alert. And all what I can suggest is if you face a situation like this, if you can find any way to do take a photograph, it's fine. By the way, if you find one of these insects sitting somewhere, you can approach it as long as your movements are slow and deliberate. You don't have to be worried that they will suddenly do something. They're only there to defend their nest. They are not interested in us individually. So that is one thing. If you ever get into a situation, and that is particularly important for people in the staff that looks after public parks and areas like this, please make sure that if you do get into a confrontation with these insects, do not run into the open fields or into an open space, because you are now an optical object for them, and they will fly a hell of a lot faster than you can run. We strongly recommend that if you get a nest disturbed, go through the bushes and crawl through the bushes as quickly as you can, because the sweeping motion of the branches will confuse the insects. Don't try to run in the open. It's hard to do, but it is effective.
Great advice. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. I know you've been very busy the last few months, really the last year, and we really appreciate you taking the time with us. And so I'll follow up with you later today to address the other questions that we weren't able to get to.
Thank you.
So I have a few more things to share. So a couple of resources that may be useful for those of you working on invasive species in Metro Vancouver. We have a new regional public brochure that highlights our worst offenders. It's available online and also through many of the local municipalities. Our website is there, the bcinvasives.ca website is there. growgreenguide.ca is also a really excellent resource, and some of the technical documents that you can find there are shown on this page. So there are a series of 15 regional best management guides. You can see the species listed there. And I see that Ken has popped that link into the chat if you want to link directly to it. They're digital resources. They're best management guides for practitioners and people who want locally sourced, scientifically sound information about how to manage these particular species. For those of you who are looking for other events related to invasive species, while there will not be options to do large gatherings in person, we'll be hosting these lunchtime forums every month or so. I don't have a date for the next one, but if you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like to see, I'd love to hear about that. The ISCBC is hosting an invasive species research mini symposium August 19th from 9 to 12. It's free. It's meant to replace the in-person research conference that was going to be held this year prior to COVID-19. We'll also be doing our online fall forum and AGM sometime in late September, October, so you can watch the date for that. We'll also be doing a technical training workshop, again, after the field season, no date for that yet. And so that's designed for practitioners who are working in the field who want to gain some technical knowledge about dealing with some of the priority invasive species in Metro Vancouver. So ways that you can keep in touch, if you want to hear about these kinds of events, you can join our listserv. So I welcome you to send me an email and I can make sure that you're a part of that. We also have a new YouTube channel. You can see some of the videos listed below. So again, as we've shifted from doing a lot of our training online, we've developed a series of really short videos on how to identify and manage some of our high priority species.